Welcome back. Part of the goal of the program is was to find Mississippi in the national narrative, and SNCC kind of begins its operations in Macomb, which we're going to talk about in the afternoon, in 1961, and then they begin a second project in 1961 in Albany, Georgia. And those two projects continue through for a long time. I mean, they never really, in a way, haven't stopped. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Albany Movement, which kind of shares a lot in common with the Macomb movement in terms of the goals and kind of outlook of the main organizers, Bob Moses and Charles Sherrod, in terms of what they hope to accomplish. But they kind of take divergent paths, both in terms of how they play out. Independent and financially secure black folks, some of them with land, who could and did provide leadership to challenge Jim Crow because they had the independence to do so. So that Albany had an infrastructure of black leadership in the business community and black farmers. We learned that Albany had one of the largest branches in the NAACP in Georgia in 1945. So Albany, outside of Atlanta, I think Albany had the second biggest branch. And that there were as many as 1,000 registered black voters in Albany in 1945. You don't get 1,000 registered black voters in southwest Georgia without having some kind of infrastructure in 1945 that's already present. We learned that in 1947, black letter carriers in Albany create something called the Criterion Club. And from this emerged an Albany Voters League, okay, in 1947. As a result of this activity, 800 black people voted in Albany in 1950. Now, Albany is not really it's one of the toughest parts in Georgia. It's a tough part of Georgia, and they've got 800 black voters in the city. I don't know what was going on in the county, but in the city there was a black voting population. We learned that in 1948, a sharecropper named Rosalie Ingram, a widowed mother of 12, was convicted of a self-defense murder of a white man, probably who attempted to rape her. And that the local NAACP called this a legal lynching and set up an NAACP Legal Defense Fund program for her appeal in 1948. And we learned about the King family of Albany, not the Martin Luther King family, but the King family of Albany, that will play a central role in the movement, in many, many parts of the movement. We learned that members of the Criterion Club held a meeting with the white Albany political leadership, a 30-minute meeting, in 1960, before Sherrod arrives, to discuss voting rights and improving infrastructure, city infrastructure in the black community. So all this happens in advance of the decision to send state field secretaries into southwest Georgia and to set up a major project there. We learned that organized groups in Albany, including the newly arrived SNCC project director and his staff, a vital NAACP youth chapter, coalesced on November 17, 1961 to form something called the Albany Movement. All that goes down within a month after the arrival of the SNCC field secretaries. All in all, we learned that, like so many places throughout the South, Albany was already organized, already had a culture of resistance, and had deep and profound institutions to challenge oppression. All of that existed in Albany in advance of the arrival of SNCC, and certainly, obviously in advance of the arrival of SCLC, which came 2 or 3 months after SNCC showed up. We also learned about the role, and this is more in the traditional narrative, and I think even in the non-traditional narrative. I think Southwest Georgia gets a lot of credit for the whole music in the movement piece, right? That the iconic sound of the Snake Freedom Singers comes out of Southwest Georgia. Though everywhere there are Snake Freedom Singers come from different states, they're not all from Southwest Georgia, and music was used everywhere as an organizing and recruiting tool. The Southwest Georgia sound kind of becomes iconic in the movement. And was it Aaron Henry or was it Amzie Moore who got it in churches? Amzie Moore, yeah. So he was doing that before this, right? Yeah. So but when we think, certainly to the extent that music is talked about at all as an organizing tool, and certainly the traditional narrative, it probably, in most cases, it'll come in the Albany section. That's where it'll come. Most importantly, we learned that the Albany movement was not a failure and was not there to play a specific role in the King narrative. In other words, the purpose of Albany didn't emerge so that King could get to Birmingham, which is really kind of the way it's laid out. If we move past 1962, we learn about the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and the ongoing project to sustain black farmers. That all emerges out of the Albany movement. And the role of Southwest Georgia farmers in the successful and ongoing lawsuit with the USDA and black farmers generally. How many of you know about the USDA lawsuit? Yeah. So, I mean, this isn't really the time or place for it, but it's been demonstrated, and I think the USDA lost in court, that they had intentionally involved themselves in a process primarily using credit markets, primarily, of taking land from black farmers, basically declaring them bankrupt so black farmers had to sell their land. One of the great stories in American history was how by 1920 black farmers had 1 million acres of land, from slavery days to the 1920s. And then from the 1920s on, there's been a process of collusion between primarily southern white political entities, southern financial and northern financial entities, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I mean, it's not open to dispute. All engage in a process of taking that land from black farmers. And I believe they won twice in court, and they still haven't really settled. I don't think the money, so they won't appropriate the money, but I think they've lost twice already. And I think that Southwest Georgia and Shirley Sherrod and others were involved in that process, and others. I mean, it's all over the South, but Southwest Georgia played a role in that. That's a great story. None of you know that story. That's just truly, and it's ongoing. I mean, it's not over yet. Yeah. We also learned that for a period of time, the Albany Police Department had as the logo on their squad cars a black hand and white hand shaking hands, which was the SNCC logo. This is not the sign of a failure of a movement. This is a sign of an ongoing movement that won some important victories. And we learned that the Sherrods, Charlie and Shirley, stayed in Albany and organized for decades and are still in Albany, still organizing. Charles Sherrod served on the city council, and Shirley Sherrod was involved in the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, and they never stopped. Involved in education. I mean, they just never stopped, they never left. All this helps explain why SNCC created the project in Southwest Georgia. Southwest Georgia was ready, and if you could win in Southwest Georgia, you could win anywhere. And if you could win there, you could seize power, as there was a black majority in counties around Albany. And so if you could take control of Southwest Georgia, there were enough black people there to just win elections. And so with that, I want to pause before I go in another direction, see if there's any questions or comments or things people want to say about the Albany movement or questions.
what extent did other white sheriffs attempt to or successfully learn from tribes appropriate?
To my knowledge, there would be none. I don't know if you want to. And I think even around Southwest Georgia, there were some pretty bad sheriffs. I'm going to talk about one, but to my knowledge, I think he was unique. And I think their political leadership was more. They were. I don't want us to think that the Albany political leadership was not thoroughly committed to segregation. They were, but they were just more, had a little more on the ball, than I think the average. So to my knowledge, there are no other sheriffs like that.
Mayor Daley.
Where was he?
In Chicago.
Oh, Mayor Daley.
Mayor Daley read up on Dr. King's tactics in Albany and Montgomery, and so when they came to push the poor people's movement up north, that Daley would not allow him to march over there would create a crisis, but he would get out and make a protest to go home and walk the street. He would not let the crisis happen with the confrontation with protesters and activists and police. Then he scheduled a meeting with Dr. King, and when Dr. King showed up, he had already acquiesced to whatever demands he thought Dr. King was going to ask for. So it was very, say that again. Anticlimactic. And Dr. King was very frustrated by it. You read about it, he was quite frustrated because Mayor Daley was like, "You're not going to come to Chicago and tell me how to run my town," basically what he said, and you don't need the civil rights movement here in Chicago to find. So that actually ended up kind of leaving and was like, "You want long line."
Well, there were confrontations in Chicago.
Oh, I'm not saying there weren't confrontations, but it wasn't what they wanted it to be. And so the police would not let it get, because I don't know if y'all know about Chicago, but like in Macomb, they would bomb you too, just because you wanted to move into a neighborhood. And so there was this level of violence that would be visited upon people and people in the wrong areas of the city. So Dr. King wanted to do that. So they were trying to limit where they could go, where they could march, all these ways to try to confuse and not have to do nothing change. Open housing laws.
Right. That would be an example of Daley trying that same thing. Well, what I'm saying is that well, the structure was there, but they also, I think in one book they called it the toughest nut to crack, Southwest Georgia. And so SNCC went to these places that other people wouldn't go. In other words, and they went there because, one, if you could crack it in Macomb or in the Delta, then, there are easier spots than that. And secondly, if you were going to risk your life, you would do it in a place where if you did it, you would seize power. So if you go to some place that might be a little bit safer because black folk aren't in the majority, you're still going to risk your life, and if you win, the white folk will keep electing the same sheriff. But if you win in Southwest Georgia, you're going to elect the sheriff. Right? So the idea then was that if you could do it in Southwest Georgia, which I think might have been the toughest part of Georgia, if you could do it in Macomb, which might have been the toughest part of Mississippi, or in the Delta, then pretty much, other parts couldn't be harder than that.
Those would be big victories.
Those would be big victories. And also, I think, it gets to this question of power. In other words, if you're going to do that, you're going to do it where the payoff is controlling your own destiny. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just thinking then, if all the resources are there and it's not, at least not told as a success, certainly there are probably smaller scale successes. But that seems to have the potential to be really demoralizing. So if you sort of go in where you think your chances are good and the payout that you lose, that seems to have, bigger payout, but also sort of bigger setbacks psychologically kind of morale. And so I'm wondering how, if you think like SEL to be able to just
SNCC, when the SNCC actually lived and stayed in the community. I mean, Charles Sherrod Jr. was there organizing people in the community. In fact, Charles Sherrod is still there. I'm not sure how much organizing he's doing, but he's still there. And if he's there, he's trying to organize somebody right now. So when King went into Birmingham, you know, this was much more of a mobilization operation. I mean, they didn't go in Birmingham to stay there and organize over time. I mean, James Bevel and James Orange and all those people associated with Dr. King went in there to mobilize people to make and create a national scene. They did. You know about Birmingham because of the dogs and the bombs and the fire hoses, but that was clearly not the SNCC way of operating. And so that was a profound difference. King moved on, but SNCC people stayed there, and some of them are indeed still there. So that's a profound difference.
So it's just in what we call the mobilizing versus organizing. So SEL was kind of mobilizing piece and there's an organizing strategy. I just want to, can we just speak to this?
I have a question. So the background you were giving us about the pre-existing organization and autonomy of African Americans in Albany, does that come from the books that you recommended at Kolnick? I asked because it's like in those terms, I'm gonna have to like really reshape the way that I teach this because when I open it, I kind of foreshadow by talking about Lori Fisher, but also by using this quote from Charles Sherrod about how about the fear in the area, like how people would cross. I can't remember exactly, but it's like people would cross the street, they didn't want to look at them, they didn't want to associate with them. So it's kind of like this foreshadowing, like, oh, this movement is due to fail, and that Lori Fisher, and you have this element of fear that's so deep here. But apparently, that's not exactly the story. I want to know if it's in that book that.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think everything that I told, you know, either came from the Taylor Brand, came from other things that you've read, came from this, primarily from this book, came from the Todd Boyd piece here, or the other. So everything I told you so far, you know, that is what's going around is clearly the most detailed account of Albany that I know. There is a book that looks at the civil rights movement in Georgia that looks at many other communities in Georgia, not as detailed as this on Albany and stuff. So, but it's all there. But I think the other thing to understand is that you know, what happens is that we stop, as soon as we stop looking at Albany, it's not like Albany still has Lori Pritchett and it's still segregated, you know, I mean, it's desegregated with the rest of the South. And so the idea is you can't, you know, some of the lessons that King took away from that are legitimate, you know. Try to have smaller targets so you can win a company. That's not a bad idea, you know. The federal government comes on board more easily when there's a crisis. I mean, some people see that in the freedom struggle, when the decision to bring in all of the white civil rights workers because they were killing. I mean, thought it would provide a measure of protection. So, but going back to that mobilizing piece, you know, there's a quote in here. I mean, you can, I don't know if I'll be able to find it fast enough, where Sherrod talks about trying, that it was that organizing was a psychological battle to try to bring people and overcome fear. That overcoming fear piece is important. Even in the documents that I gave you, that's in your packet, it says, he writes, the first obstacle to remove was the mental blocks in the minds of those who wanted to move, but were unable for fear that we were not who we said we were. But when people began to hear us in churches, social meetings, on the streets, in pool halls, lunchrooms, nightclubs, and other places where people gathered, they began to open up a bit. So that's where the fear, you know, so he's right about the fear piece, but then he says, how did we overcome that fear piece? By staying rooted in the community, by organizing, by living there, by not retreating, you know. And so the fact is, Sherrod is still there. I mean, the Sherrods are still there. It's 2017. And they're still there, you know. And that's a story that's not told in the national narrative
Rodney who served on the Albany City Council.
Right. For 11 or 12 years.
Yeah.
Does that help? Does that also help? Are there other questions?
It seems like there's an aspect of Dr. King and NAACP and so forth that is kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, if it's working for you, it's working really well. If it isn't, you're kind of screwed. Because if they come in and with these tactics of we're finding a way around you, then it does kind of take a little of the wind out of your sails. So things don't get moving as fast because you don't have that threat of the NAACP or Dr. King coming in and marching because they've kind of taken that away.
Right. I'm going to come to the, I mean, that's kind of where I'm going to head in the second part.
Okay.
All right, but
Well, then I'll hold.
no, but I think you're exactly right, and I think again, it's very useful to kind of think carefully about the difference between mobilizing and organizing. Charles Payne's book is, I've got the Light of Freedom, the organizing tradition in Mississippi, and there's a place for mobilizing, and there's a place for organizing. But mobilizing without organizing, it's probably going to have shorter term results. And really, the both the documents that I shared with you for today, one of which is badly copied, where some words are missing, where Thomas Watkins is talking about organizing and the importance of organizing and interracial organizing. So I think you're right. I mean, and I think that's one of the tensions that we haven't talked about much yet in the seminar, because from Jim Crow through the 1950s, there's not much else but the NAACP. So the tensions in the organizations are less evident in these early years than they're going to become some labor core, has authority to the 1940s, but doesn't do much work in the South until much later. So you're going to see those tensions within the movements open up and be highly significant. And that's kind of where I'm going to go as another lesson. So everything that I've told you to this point is pretty is available in the existing literature. And then through research that I've done myself, I have 3 observations that I'd like to share that to me seem significant, that are less apparent in the literature. Many years ago, another participant in the NEH Institute where we met was Charles McDew, Chuck McDew, who was in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And because Chuck lives in Minnesota, I've visited with him, kind of independently, And he told me once, when we were talking one day, that SNCC chose the Delta, and then by default down in Macomb and Southwest Georgia because there were large black majorities. And it related to this question of black power. In other words, what I'm going to ask you to do is think about black power in a different way as well. That if we think about black power as something emerged in the Meredith March, then I think we're not understanding all of it. So Chuck said that they wanted to go to these places with large black majorities. And in my ignorance in those days, I said, oh, because there's so many black people, they were safer there. And Chuck said, no, Jeff. The least safe places to organize were there large black majorities, because white folk were hyper-vigilant, and ultra-violent in those parts of the South where any opening represented a loss of power, white power. So if white folk couldn't control it in black majority areas, they would be voted out of power. So the areas where black folk represented a political threat were not safe places. And so they went into these areas where other people wouldn't go because the threat was great, but the payoff was power. And so if you look at the Mississippi Project was kind of interested in integration, but they were primarily interested in voter registration. And that was what the SNCC project in Southwest Georgia was about, voter registration. So voter registration in those areas is about power. Another extraordinary experience I had doing this work coming down to Jackson is I got to be on a dais with Shirley Sherrod, you know, and she told a story about the sheriff in Baker County, they called Bad Baker, whose name was L. Warren Gator Johnson. And I believe she said that he didn't really speak, he just went, "Arr!" You know, he basically just growled, you know. And at one point, I mean, they ran these counties. First of all, they inherited the positions. They were not really, they were technically elected, but they were kind of passed down. And they ran these things like medieval, they were medieval. You know, they would turn away the revenuers in the federal government, you know. I mean, they ran these counties in a way that they had total control of these sheriffs. And she talked about this guy, I'll never forget it, L. Warren Gator Johnson. I mean, this was, I don't know how many years after the movement, this is probably like 10 years ago. And the description of him was so vivid that she gave, you know, I'll never forget it, about what this guy was, and what he was about, and the way he ran the county, you know, just ran it, and how you couldn't challenge him, you know. I would say that, based on my hearing Shirley Sherrod talk about it, this guy, L. Warren Gator Johnson, was as bad as any sheriff in the nation. I don't mean bad in the way we heard in the last lecture. I mean, this guy was bad, you know, violent, scary. But sheriffs are elected. They're not like police chiefs. The sheriffs are elected. Ending Jim Crow in Albany or Baker County or any of the counties around Albany would mean that you could end the nearly medieval rule of sheriffs like Gator Johnson. And ending the rule of Gator Johnson was a very effective recruiting tactic. If you're going to say, why should I risk my life to register to vote? You can say, so you can vote in the next election for sheriff. Right? And these are real things. You get rid of that high sheriff. You know, that's a real thing that you can deliver through organizing. And might cause someone to risk everything to do it, which is really what you're talking about. So I ask us to think differently about black power and think about when we look at the black struggle for freedom and we push it back to slavery days, or we push it back to Reconstruction, or we push it back to the Jim Crow era. How often is it not just institution building and struggle, but how often is it about black power, about black people having the capacity to shape their own destinies, to control their own institutions, to teach their own curriculum? Right? So I ask us to think about that. When we think about power, we should be thinking about white power, we should be thinking about black power, and pushing that part of the curriculum, that part of the chronology back as well. Not just starting that story in 65 or 66, but pushing that question of power back, because we can sometimes lose sight. You know, I think Ella Baker said it's more than a hamburger. You know, we're not sitting down at lunch counters, you know, to order a hamburger. It's more than a hamburger. And that's about power. So that's one observation I have that I think is maybe not as laid out in the literature on Albany as well as it should be. And then early on, earlier on than in Mississippi, Charles Sherrod moved the Albany Movement toward integrated teams on voter registration in a kind of intentional way very early on. Sherrod wanted kind of white and black folk working together on voter registration in a way that didn't happen in Mississippi, you know, really at the beginning until 63, and then much more with the Freedom Vote, and then much more so in the Summer Project. There were a handful of white people involved in the Mississippi movement, but it wasn't kind of an intentional effort. And they were a relatively small in number. So there was not any kind of intentional effort to integrate. Whereas I think in Albany, there really was an intentional effort to have an integrated movement in Albany. And that's definitely not really in the master narrative at all, but I think the evidence is clear and unambiguous. I included an excerpt from Hollis Watkins' memoir where he talks about this decision to have white organizers in the movement, and then the tension that that created after 1964, and within SNCC and really within CORE and the movement. We don't really talk about that much. You know, that's not really part of the master narrative, and it's something that we have. I'm not going to really speak about it because we have Hollis here. I provided you with a portion of his memoir, and we'll be able to actually ask him questions and buy his memoir, since one of the pages I copied was cut off. But I think that understanding the role of white folk in SNCC and in Black Power is something that we can all do a better job teaching. You know, because in the master narrative, there's this kind of, you know, white and black together, and I think the amount of white participation in the movement is dramatically overdrawn. Just the sheer volume. I mean, the number of black folk that were committed to black freedom was exponentially higher than the number of white folk who participated in the movement, and that's not often as well understood as it should be. So we have experts here, we'll talk about that more, but I think that when you think about Albany's place in the movement, earlier than in Mississippi, you have an intentional effort to use white people in voter registration in Albany. And, yeah.
What question about that? Other than those students being white, why did they assume that they would be safer?
You mean the summer project?
Even just the workers, the core and the workers, why did the assumption that they would be safer from white, even though they were trying to voter registration and running freedom schools and all this? Other than them being white, why did they assume that?
Well, I mean, they thought it would bring federal protection. I mean, if you're bringing down a senator's son, you know, if you're bringing down the editor of this newspaper's son, or daughter, if you're bringing down a high-powered lawyer's, one of the things I learned in doing the research to do the little book on Freedom Summer is that, you know, a lot of people applied to be summer volunteers, and a lot of people were rejected. You know, I mean, you can look at the applications, right? Not everybody who applied was taken, you know, so. I don't, you want to?
I was just saying, one thing that happened, people's feeling that the community would become safer. And in Holmes County, there was a guy there working in Holmes County, whose name was Steve Bingley. And he was the nephew of powerful senator, I believe it was, who had a relationship with the governor down here as well as the senators from Mississippi. And that person made a call to top folks down here that his nephew was down there, and he wanted to make sure he had 24-hour protection. And the folks who got to work in highway patrols almost got killed trying to provide him with protection. So in Holmes County, we have a security system. So, you know, there were a lot of people that felt white and rain about more security than not doing.
That was part of it. I mean, you know, I mean, and so I mean, I think that I don't think they were naive in thinking that. I think we're sitting here with two veterans, but I mean, there was black folk were getting killed again and again and again, and the federal government was doing nothing and ignoring it, and they thought, you know, that if some white folk got killed, you know, that might bring a level of attention by the federal government. You know, I mean, that was what. Which it did. That's what I'm saying. They weren't naive, you know. I mean, I mean, you can go back and read the minutes of the meetings where it's debated, you know. So And I think that's why. I mean, I think that the federal government was, moved only as much as they were made to move.
Political is speaking.
Yeah. That's not to say, yeah, but I would say that.
Well, I would think that they were naive. I was wondering, like, why some people assume that. It still is Mississippi, it still is Alabama, it still is Georgia, you know what I mean? Some people didn't see color, they saw power. You're challenging my power, I don't care what color you are. You're Italian.
Yeah, they killed Shorter Goodwin and Cheney. So, yeah, but the idea was
No,
that.
you could have lying about where they were from. They looked for them and knew where they were the whole time. Maybe the white priest and minister, I don't remember what city it was, it was really sad story about how the white ministers, they were came out for the march, they might have been.
So.
And they came in town initially, and then they broke for lunch, walked back to me, and they killed the white priest and the young pastor. Even Christians don't do right. Like Christians in the South don't do right.
And I think, as Charles McKinney said, we have to always bear in mind this backdrop. I mean, in the story of the Black Freedom Movement, black people are at the center of that story. But the backdrop is this kind of white violence that's always present. And I mean, we heard it this morning, regarding Medgar Evers. I mean, I don't know how you guys felt listening to that, but you kind of know what's going to happen in 63. I mean, even though you're kind of going, go, Medgar, go, And as he goes and goes, you go, oh man, he's going to be dead next month. So I mean, we know how that story is going to end, The last point that I want to make is a speculative one, and I open this up for your comments, which is why Southwest Georgia project remained regional and the Mississippi project went statewide. In other words, the Southwest Georgia project remains in Southwest Georgia, and in Mississippi you have COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations, and a kind of statewide organizing strategy. And I don't think it's because Charles Sherrod didn't imagine it going statewide, and Bob Moses did. I don't think it's quite that simple. So I want to provide some ideas about that. And I think that leadership matters, and I don't mean the local leadership. In 1962, you get the Council of Federated Organizations in Minnesota, and I think in the little book that we have, what? In Mississippi, yeah. In Mississippi. Shit. Did I say Minnesota? I didn't say Georgia? Shit. Because I'm in Southwest Minnesota State, that's what it is. And in the little book of documents on Mississippi, we have a really interesting document that Tom Gaither and Bob Moses write, where they're really proposing the COFO and the summer project in a way, very early, 3 years before it happens. I encourage you to take a look at that document in the book. But I think that leadership matters. And so in Mississippi, you have the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, and we've been talking about that a lot the last few days, but I can't stress how important the Regional Council of Negro Leadership is. And then you develop this network of black leaders. Mrs. Hamer was in it, and Aaron Henry, and C.C. Bryan, and Amzie Moore, and many, many, many others. And that statewide network is critical for the ability of COFO to organize at the statewide level. And then I think it's also important that the Regional Council of Negro Leadership was not headquartered in Jackson, right? If it had been headquartered in Jackson, it might have been more jealous of its power than being headquartered in Mount Bayou, Because think about where the headquarters of the Georgia NAACP is. Where is it? Atlanta, right? And so I think that the Regional Council of Negro Leadership provides a capacity for statewide organizing that already existed in Mississippi, and then the fact that it wasn't located in Jackson allowed outstate people to exercise greater authority than whatever black capital and black leadership existed in Jackson. Okay, gave people in the outstate areas greater authority probably, or more power, or more connections. This is all speculative. This is what I'm thinking. Then I think, you look at the NAACP, and you think about Vernon Jordan, who's the field secretary of the NAACP in Georgia, versus Medgar Evers, who we just heard about, who is challenging the national NAACP, and Aaron Henry, who we really haven't said enough about, who's the president, the elected president of the statewide NAACP. And Aaron Henry's not in Jackson. He's in Clarksville. He's in Clarksville, So I think that, and Medgar Evers is not from Jackson. He moves to Jackson. He's from Decatur, worked in nonviolent. So I think the capacity of black leadership in Minnesota, black leadership in Mississippi was much more dispersed around the state than it was in Georgia. And I only know this from, I haven't done research on Georgia, but I know from talking to people that Atlanta was jealous of its power. And not only had the statewide NAACP, but also SCLC was based there. And that it was hard to get Atlanta to give up power and authority to other communities. And so I want us to look, as I conclude, at the document from Sherrod that I gave you. And this is a little bit edited, so when I was doing my research, I came across this document, I copied it, and he talks, that opening paragraph is important, but then he says in the second paragraph, he says, from the beginning, we had, as Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee field people, visited the NAACP youth chapter, introduced ourselves, and outlined our project for voter registration. We pointed out the differences between the two organizations and advanced the hope that we could work together. And then he says later on, I think Sherrod Emery came to Macomb. They were came to Mississippi, and they got arrested, and they had to go back to Mississippi to stand trial. And so he writes that they were going to prepare. They were preparing for some kind of actions. And they said, unfortunately, Cordell Reagan and I had to go to Mississippi for trials on October 30th of October, and so we were not present at the meeting of the Youth Council of the NAACP. It was there that the action which had been planned was canceled. We later learned that 2 regional officers of the NAACP had come to Atlanta, from Atlanta to Albany, to call off the demonstration. Okay, I don't think that kind of stuff was happening frequently in Mississippi, And then he concludes by saying, in this last paragraph, is really a smart paragraph. He concludes and says, but the importance of this meeting, this is the meeting that created the Albany Movement. The importance of this meeting lies in its structure. The real issue immediately took the form of a question. Would the organizations involved be willing to lose their identity as separate groups and cooperate under the name the Albany Movement? Now, these would be the Criterion Club, the Voters League. These are organizations that have been in existence for 15 years or 12 years or 13 years. All the organizations had to caucus. The Baptist Ministerial Alliance, the Interdenominational Alliance, the Criterion Club, the Lincoln Heights Improvement Association, Federated Women's Clubs of Albany, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and its coordinate groups, Youth Council, Albany Voters League, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. All these organizations were caucusing. There were other interested persons who were members of such groups as the American Legion, but none there as official representatives. These groups later gave their support. After a short period of deliberation, the groups were ready to give their opinions. All the groups were willing to lose their identity in the local organization except the NAACP, whose delegates requested time to receive directives from the national office. So they said, we got to contact Roy Wilkins and ask for permission. Okay, I don't think he gave it, But I'm not certain that Aaron Henry asked for permission, to join COFA. So when we think about, the fighting Mississippi and the national narrative, one of the things that makes Mississippi unique is COFA. And when we think about Albany, one of the things that makes it unique is this kind of early integration that occurs. And so I don't know why Mississippi developed COFO and Southwest Georgia didn't. Both had visionary leaders, both had strong institutional basis. But I leave that question for other scholars to work on. So are there other questions about the Albany movement? The people, that's all I have. I have nothing to share. Are there other questions or comments or observations about the Albany movement? Yeah.
Mississippi went statewide.
Mhm.
You may just be sure to the Rapids. Mississippi is the most high proportion of African Americans in the state. And they're spread out all over the state. They're not concentrated in certain areas. So you can drive from North Mississippi all the way down to Southern Mississippi, and you're gonna find Black people wherever you go. And that's one of the things after I moved here to town. Completely fascinating. I could live in places like Chicago where they're residents segregated. In states like Washington, where Black folks basically live in Seattle and, Pasco, Kennewick, those places, and Miles, Cleo, places like that. And, so we could also share demographics. Have more people to organize and mobilize on a statewide basis, plus the great leadership to do so.
There's certainly a lot of.
Yeah, one other thing that was taken under consideration is that Mississippi has two economic states. And we had similar programs, then we should be able to eat out of the same pot. Rather than you having a goal here and I got a goal there, and when I run out, I'm just running out. Same as you, so that was another thing that taken under consideration. The little money that we all had, we gotta, we used it rather than going our separate directions.
And then, clearly, it was the rural nature of the state of Mississippi too, versus in Georgia you have Atlanta, in Mississippi you have Jackson, but also in Georgia you have Savannah, you have Columbus, throw in Macon. You had more concentrations of leadership, and therefore you had more people who had power bases in those places, and you didn't have the kind of power bases in Mississippi that they had in Georgia, or you still have. Meridian, Vicksburg was not quite like the cities, actually cities in Georgia versus towns in Mississippi. And I think that was a real factor. So, why there's so many counties in Mississippi? Because they had a whole lot of white segregation that wanted something named after them.
We had a lot of counties in Georgia too.
So I have a question. I've only been here 2 semesters, well, my second semester, so maybe someone else can answer this question for me. With the problem of getting people to vote here in Mississippi and mobilizing and putting the people who need elected positions, why isn't that position of the co-vote now? Because it seems like the same problems we had then, we definitely still have them now. And shouldn't that be the aim? Because especially at university, you can put your own students, groom them for leadership positions, help them assume power, and get the resources you need to bring them back to the community. I know it's not that easy, but why isn't that the sole mission of the COFO now?
One reason is COFO is part of the university, it's a state institution. One, there aren't activists that work at COFO and it's Keith James' job.
Yeah, so that's what I'm wondering, because when we talk about the COFO then and now, I was wondering in my mind, how can we have the same problem? Why are we, we should be walking out the street and registered vote.
Well, lots of groups do so. NAACP does so, lots of groups do voter registration, and I mean, wait till the next large election and watch and see how many groups come out to do voter registration drive. So there's lots of people all over the state who do voter registration. So it's not registration is not the problem. Getting out to vote isn't the problem. So lots of people are registered who don't vote. So that's the issue. From what I see, it's not necessarily being able to register, but it's actually showing up to vote on this. On our campus, you know what the turnout was on our campus for the last election? Not the president, not the mayor, but the last presidential election. We had 2,000 our own precinct right here in the building.
We need to be.
It's horrible.
We definitely
It's
should.
shameful.
At least
I heard some white folks laughing about it somewhere next door one day after the election. I was like,
But 11,000, like even 10,000 votes or 5,000 votes can whip an election around.
yeah, you tell who you telling, I know. I think I'm running for mayor. I got 4,000 votes right here.
Yeah, so,
Right here.
Feelings of political scientists right there.
how do we use the institution we have and the students we have, because you have 10,000 votes plus staff, at all times you can change any election.
Remember, the first part, everybody doesn't live here.
But they can
Everyone's
change
not
their
stayed,
address.
but why would you want to?
So they can vote here.
Why would you want to if you're from New Jersey and you're only going to school in Mississippi? Why would you want to change your registration? I'm just saying.
You've been here 4 years, that's a long time.
I'm sorry, I'm from New Jersey, what are you talking about? I'm just saying, that's people's attitudes. I'm from Chicago, I'll vote at home. That's what my students tell me. So students are not residents here, and Justin State does not give you in-state tuition after your first couple of years here. Once you're out of state, you're always out of state,
Yes.
period. So that's not an incentive to change your registration or anything else here. I wouldn't even change my tax here. If that was, no, I'm just saying, I'm just being honest. So you have to remember that, yes, we do have 9,000 students, but what percentage of them are actually Mississippi residents and are eligible to vote here? So that's the first question you have to ask. So leaving aside students, you got a city that's almost 80% black. Why aren't they showing up? You know who voted during the mayoral election? 30,000 people, 172,000 people live in the city of Jackson. 80% of them were black people. They didn't show up to vote for black men.
But I mean, I don't think that black, well, I won't even say black, I won't say that voter apathy is anything that just started in 2017. I mean, if during the 2008 election, one more black person came up to me and said, you know, I just registered to vote, this is important. Indian has always been important. But it's not just that. I mean, the colleges everywhere, I'm sure every single one of your colleges does voter registration and voter turnout and takes students by the busloads, by droves to go and vote. I know personally we do it on our campus.
Well, I don't have to go anywhere because you come to this building and walk right up over there to the room and vote. We got our own precinct in this building.
Right, and some schools do. I know ours doesn't have one on there, but we did take students to vote, and I had a ridiculous amount of students who, so, you know, I won't ask you who you voted for, but you did vote yesterday, right? No, it doesn't matter, you know, your person doesn't ever get in. How do you know if you don't vote?
Well, the thing is in Mississippi, if you just look at the numbers, and we have to remember that there's a difference between people who are eligible to vote and people who are voting age population. So voting age is 18 and over. But voting eligible means I don't have felonies, I don't, you know, whatever restrictions you have on your voting. So that's a different number of people who show up. And just looking at the election statewide for Johnny Dupree, when he ran for governor of Mississippi, I thought he was a good candidate. However, in my opinion, they were playing patty cake too much to two candidates, and there wasn't enough differentiation between the two of them. It was like, you think that? I think that too. You think that? I think that too, right? It was too much of that during the election, so there was no real distinction between the two people running. But the split here is 60-30, 60% white folks and 30% black people. So if everybody showed up to vote who was eligible, you still can't win on a statewide level for governor. It's just difficult. So you need some of the white folks to peel off and vote for the other candidate. But Mississippi is also classic for racial block voting. The white folks are going to vote for the white candidate, and the black folks are going to vote for the black candidate. And I don't care if you're talking about governor or dog catcher. You want to tell me a story about the young guy who ran for the city clerk or something? When he one day said that's his kid.
Oh, so when we first came, and Michael was running for comptroller of the state. And it was the first, his reconstruction,
Speak up, Michelle.
the first black statewide elected official. And he'd been working with state government for 12 years, you know, with money and no stigma around that, which is unusual. He ran for office and he was defeated by a 27-year-old kid who worked for his dad. I mean,
Right, no experience. The guy ran the office that he was running for 10 years, and they still was like, I'm gonna vote for the dog catcher day. Because he's the white guy. And that's just what happens in Mississippi. Racial block voting is real. So,
White guys now the lieutenant governor.
yes, it is. So depressing.
Who will be next governor.
be showing up to vote on a regular basis. I'm not saying it's right, but this is, you gotta do a cost benefit analysis of your
Okay, so
time
yeah.
versus effort, you know what I mean?
Then we have to ask, what's the alternative? What's your alternative?
We're living an alternative right now.
I
We're
mean,
living it.
if you say voting doesn't matter, and one of the demographics, I like to show my students.
And we're not saying it doesn't matter, we're saying that you don't, that you.
Well, no, I'm just
You don't
saying.
get what you want.
I'm just saying. See, and I have to disagree with, even if you vote, you don't get what you want. One of the demographics I showed my students was the first time that Bush won, the election that they stole. He won by less people than who live in my subdivision. And I don't live in a very, very large subdivision. I mean, I can ride my bike from one end to the other. I walk from one end to the other to get my 1 hour of exercise on a regular day. So he won by less people than live in my neighborhood. And I'm thinking, do you realize how small a percentage that is? So if we're sitting back and we're saying, my guy doesn't get in and the qualified person doesn't win, then what do we say our alternative is? Do we say, okay, so I don't go to vote because it doesn't matter anyway, which is what a large contingent of our youth are saying, it doesn't matter anyway, so why even bother? Why even fight to get my voter rights back? It's not going to do anything for me. Or do I keep going out and voting and I keep putting pressure?
I don't think we're saying not why we don't, why fight for our voter rights. I don't think that's what young people are saying.
But I think that there's a third option. The third option is I keep going there and I keep voting, but I also keep putting pressure on the people who are saying that they're for me. You say you're for me, then what are you doing for me? If you're not doing anything for me, get to second and put somebody else in.
Well, the thing is, in American politics, our system, there's a whole lot of self-selection. So initially, we don't even choose people who run for office. People self-select. So that's the first problem. The second problem is the winner-take-all system. The third problem is called the electoral college. The fourth problem is voter ID and all these tactics to keep people from showing up to vote. Closing polling places, moving them, not having enough voting machines. When I talk about the cost-benefit analysis, people like us who look at it from an intellectual standpoint, who are regular voters and have studied this, of course it makes sense to register and vote early and vote often. But for the person who is dispossessed and marginalized, and they see themselves voting and voting and voting, and nothing ever changes. I saw this just very dramatic meme on Facebook, and it said, black folks been voting Democrats since 1932, and we still poor. So what has changed? Doing the same thing over and over again and getting the same result and still expect something different. What is that called? Insanity.
And
I agree. You and I agree. I'm an avid voter. As for me in my house, we vote. That's the rule. But because I believe in the power of voting, I know people who struggle for the vote. I understand that struggle, but there are so many structural barriers to not voting, but to getting the candidate of your choice. That's the problem, and that's why Benny Thompson's been in office for 50 years, because he's the dude who keeps running. So,
You know, I'm gonna seize control because we can continue this conversation. But we have Hollis Watkins and Leslie McMore who are gonna, or at least Hollis is gonna talk about his experience, and I want to hear it. So do we want to break or do we want to go straight? Break? So why don't we reassemble at 3 o'clock? We don't need 12 minutes. Why don't we reassemble at 5 minutes to 3 o'clock, 2:55.